Combat Sambo, the Russian martial art that does almost everything. Imagine taking wrestling, judo, and boxing, and putting them all into one fighting system. That's basically Combat Sambo. It's fast, aggressive, and incredibly well-rounded. And even though it has produced some of the most famous fighters in MMA history, a lot of people have never actually watched a Combat Sambo fight. So, what exactly is Combat Sambo? Let's start at the beginning. Sambo was developed in the Soviet Union during the early 20th century. The word Sambo comes from a Russian phrase that roughly translates to self-defense without weapons. The idea was pretty simple. Take the most effective techniques from different martial arts, combine them, and create a practical fighting system. Sambo was influenced by wrestling, judo, and several traditional fighting styles. Eventually, different forms of Sambo developed. The two most well-known are Sport Sambo and Combat Sambo. And Combat Sambo is where things get really interesting, because unlike Sport Sambo, you can actually punch each other. Combat Sambo combines throws, takedowns, submissions, and striking, so you could be fighting on your feet 1 second, get thrown to the ground the next, and then find yourself defending an arm lock. That's what makes it so unpredictable. A Combat Sambo fighter has to be comfortable pretty much everywhere. They need to know how to strike, they need to know how to wrestle, they need to know how to throw, and they need to know how to submit someone, and the throws are brutal. Sambo fighters are extremely good at taking people off their feet. You'll see hip throws, trips, wrestling takedowns, and explosive leg attacks. And because the fighters are constantly looking for opportunities to throw or take each other down, the fight can change in an instant. One moment you're standing in front of your opponent, and the next, you're flying through the air. Then there's the grappling. Combat Sambo has a huge emphasis on submissions, particularly attacks on the arms and legs. Leg locks are especially important. A fighter might appear to be controlling the position, and then suddenly dive onto their opponent's leg. If the other fighter doesn't react quickly, the fight can be over almost immediately. But there's another factor that completely changes the way you grapple: striking. You can't just sit comfortably on the ground. Your opponent is allowed to punch you, and that changes everything. A position that might be perfectly safe in a grappling competition can become a terrible position when someone is allowed to punch you in the face. That's why Combat Sambo tends to look so aggressive. You're not just thinking about getting a submission. You're also thinking about strikes, takedowns, control, and improving your position. And this is where Combat Sambo's connection to MMA becomes really interesting. One of the biggest names associated with Sambo is Fedor Emelianenko. Fedor became one of the greatest heavyweight fighters in MMA history. He could punch, he could wrestle, he could throw people, and he could submit them, and he could switch between all of those skills incredibly quickly. Then there's Khabib Nurmagomedov. Khabib's background wasn't simply Combat Sambo, but Sambo was an important part of the combat sports environment he came from. And when you watched Khabib fight, you could see the same idea: close the distance, take the opponent down, control them, and make them deal with you from one position after another. So is Combat Sambo basically MMA? Not exactly. The sports have a lot in common, but the rules are different. Combat Sambo also has its own equipment, including the famous Sambo jacket. That jacket can actually be used during throws and grappling exchanges. MMA fighters obviously don't have that. So while Combat Sambo and MMA overlap quite a lot, they're still two different sports. But here's the strange thing about Combat Sambo. Despite producing fighters who went on to become huge MMA stars, the sport itself is still relatively unknown in many parts of the world. It's much more popular in Russia and parts of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. It never developed the same global professional scene as boxing, MMA, or even Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But its influence is hard to ignore, because the biggest strength of Combat Sambo is versatility. A good Combat Sambo fighter doesn't need the fight to happen in one particular area. If you're standing, they can strike. If you get close, they can throw you. If you go to the ground, they can grapple. And while you're trying to defend a submission, they can still hit you. That's a pretty horrible situation to be in. Of course, Combat Sambo isn't perfect. A specialist from another martial art could still have an advantage in their particular area. A world-class boxer will probably have better pure boxing. A world-class wrestler will probably have more specialized wrestling, and a top Brazilian jiu-jitsu fighter will probably have a deeper understanding of submissions. But combat sambo isn't really about being the best at one thing. It's about being dangerous at everything. And that's what makes it so interesting. It isn't some secret Russian superpower. It's simply a combat sport that forces its fighters to become comfortable with striking, wrestling, throws, and submissions. And when you look at the fighters that have come from that background, it's pretty easy to understand why combat sambo has such a reputation, because if someone can punch you, throw you, take you down, control you, and then submit you, you're probably going to have a very, very long night.